Do you have any other thoughts on?
Yeah, and then especially when you're coming back from injury, or even the testing, the strength and power testing that you do with Bing a lot, we are very concerned with asymmetries and are your legs even or within, about 10%. But when you're coming back from an injury, we're very concerned with how your strength is side to side, and then how your power is side to side, and that is what's going to determine when you're ready to return to your sport. And that's the single leg power, and the symmetry of your power is probably the single most important factor when returning an athlete to a sport and being confident that you can return them safely. And if that power is up there, then we feel really good about taking you guys back into your sport. And if it's not, then we have to just slow the process down a little bit. But it's something that we're very concerned with, especially in the entire rehabilitation phase.
Yeah, and it sucks sometimes when we're trying to get that symmetry back, we're trying to get those profiles back, and it's not happening as quickly as we might want. And people often see that as us holding the athlete back. And it sucks to be put in that position, because what we want and what athletes want is the same thing. We want your peak performance and your absolute best. And I guess because we understand how high of a risk it is to go back with asymmetry or not being really back to that 92% that we're kind of looking for, we know how high of a risk that is, and so we want you to get back to where you need to be in order to perform. And so we're looking at the same thing, but from one end of the spectrum, you could say, oh, you're holding them back, you're not letting them do what they want. But in our eyes, we've got the long game in view, and it's like we want to make sure that this doesn't happen again, and that when you come back, you're full speed, 100%. And that's the most important thing to us. And so, we're all on the same page, athletes, staff, everyone, and coaches, everyone's on the same page as far as what the end goal is. But sometimes it gets misperceived. Is that a word?
Yeah, misperceived.
Misperceived. Sounds like a word. Sometimes people perceive that as us trying to reel an athlete back in or not letting them go, and that's really not the case. We want, just as much as that athlete does, we want them to win and to succeed, and we just want to make sure that they're ready to do that before we send them out into the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
Next thought that I had that I kind of listed down to chat about is screens, and I know that's kind of I don't know if it's controversial, but it's talked about a lot. So the FMS or any specific screening that a company does or anything. What other major screens are there?
There's less for landing.
I don't even know.
There's a lot of different ones. That's another very catchy thing to do now, is to create a screening and sell it. So.
Yeah. Yep. So sometimes that stuff's helpful, and what it can be helpful for is identifying small dysfunction or imbalances. And this is what I mentioned earlier as sometimes there are little things you can do to help with your robustness and help find that balance or symmetry that you need. And just as a simple example, this hits very close to home for me, because I used to be more of a strength and power athlete, and I got to a point where I was incredibly, incredibly strong, but I was having pain in the simplest of movements with very light weight. And so what that taught me is that I had a way of kind of masking an issue and working around an issue. And I was able to accomplish a goal of moving a lot of weight, but I was doing it in not a good, how do you even say that? It's not sequentially smart, or my body was figuring out a shortcut to get somewhere because there was a roadblock. And instead of fixing that roadblock, my body was just we're going to figure out another way to do it. And that led to pain, which led to issues. And that is something that screens can help identify at times. And I know you've seen a lot of this stuff, especially in some of the sports that we work with, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think one characteristic of a high-level athlete is they're really good at compensating. They're the best compensators in the world.
Yeah.
That's why they've gotten to where they are. And we understand that, but some of the compensation patterns or movement patterns that they perform to get to that level can be risky for injury, or can maybe predispose your back or your hip for injury. So when we talk about screens, we want to kind of identify those things that we pick out that could be adjusted or tweaked a little bit to keep you healthy. And that's really all it is. We just want to translate stuff that we can prevent in the weight room and then prevent it skiing. And the problem we run into is if you do something in the weight room, whether it's like a back position or a knee position, you're probably doing it skiing, and if you do those things constantly, you're going to get injured, or you're going to run into problems and soreness. And so I think that's what we're ultimately trying to do, is just clean everything up.
Yeah.
So there's not a constant bad pattern that you're doing all the time.
Right. And what's tough is that you can do that improper pattern once or twice and it's not a big deal. But when you do it over and over and over and over again, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of times, that's when it leads to an issue. And like back issues specifically, that's how you wear those discs down, is by making those, they're very small, insignificant things that normally you do once and you're like, whatever. You pick a box up with a rounded back, it's not that big of a deal a couple times. But if you're doing that all the time, those stresses add up, and that's what wears away at backs. And that's what a lot of these little things, like these screens, can help identify compensatory patterns like that that you want to fix and you want to identify moving forward. Another thing I wanted to chat about is basically loading. So Tim Gabbett has led a lot of this research, acute to chronic ratios, which that's like its own half-hour video or multiple hour presentation, and so I don't want to get into it too much, but the idea of how much are you loading yourself in regards to what you're prepared to do, and how many days of loading have you had in a row, and how are you progressing your loading. And these are things that normally your sport coach or athletic development coach are planning these things, and they have those things in mind, but it's something you want to pay attention to, especially when you're out on your own training. If you haven't been training much, maybe you're a high-level athlete, but you just took 3 or 4 weeks off at the end of your season, and you take 3 or 4 weeks off, and then you hop back into the gym, and you go 5 days in a row really hard. Your body hasn't been doing anything like that in recent history, so in the last month, and all of a sudden you put this huge training load on it. You do a lot in a short amount of time, and all of Tim Gabbett's research and a lot of the research on acute to chronic ratios are showing that significantly increases your risk for injury. And so there's a graph that goes around a lot now, and it applies to a lot of different sports, but it's called basically the sweet spot of training. And I think in the graph, I don't have it in front of me, but I think it's 0.8 to 1.3 is kind of the sweet spot. And so a 1.0 ratio means what you did in the last 7 days is exactly the same loading as what you have done on average in the last 30 days or 28 days. There's a lot of different ways to calculate that ratio. A ratio of 1.5, for example, means you've done 50% more this week than you did on average in the last 4 weeks. And so that means you're ramping up your training a lot in recent history as compared to the previous 3 weeks. And so considering how quickly you're ramping back into training is very important. And so that could be training your sport or training in the weight room. And that's why when you take a big break, oftentimes you've probably experienced working with different coaches that we slowly build you back into things instead of just throwing you straight into the fire, because that's just a huge risk. So something to think about, especially if you are writing or in charge of your own training. Have you read too much of this stuff, or do you?
Nah, I've seen like one presentation. It's super interesting, but I don't know it that well.
And again, it's not a predictor. It's not a predictor of injury. It's just like the higher that ratio gets. So if you're at a 3.0 and you're doing significantly more this week than in previous history, you're just statistically at a higher and higher and higher risk for injury. And so just paying attention to that loading is pretty important. And last thing, I know we're going a little bit long, but last thing I wanted to mention was just general wellness. And so if you fill out a wellness questionnaire, filling out things like readiness to train or motivation to train, and then general well-being, psychological well-being, things that you get from a simple conversation of how are you doing today. And you need to be aware of how you're feeling and what other stressors you have, especially if you're in a high-risk sport or a sport that needs your entire focus, full focus. Because if you're not in the game mentally or even physically, if you recognize that you're having an off day, something's going on, you need to take that into account with your training. And that's something that's really important. You have to recognize that. A lot of times a coach doesn't always see that, but the athletes should be empowered to speak up to the coach. You know, if they're having a day where they come in and they know something's off, or even they didn't sleep well, maybe they woke up at 2 in the morning and couldn't go back to sleep, and they show up at the gym at 9 and they're just like, I feel like garbage. That training should be adjusted, unless there's something like crazy and very specific that the coach is trying to do. But like, you need to take that, as a coach, you need to take that into account. And for an athlete, that means if something like that is happening, you should communicate that with your coach. Because though in the short term your training might be reduced, in the long term that's way better for you. And it's going back to keeping the long game in mind, taking care of you in the short game so that you can be your best in the long term. Do you have any closing thoughts? Anything on that or anything prior that we didn't mention?
No, I think the biggest thing on wellness is like it's a good way for us to get to know you guys and, you know, cater what we're doing to you. And it's a good way for you to like be honest with yourself and understand what you're capable of when you're feeling good and what you're capable of when you're feeling, you know, crappy or tired. And it allows everyone to get to know each other better, and it ultimately provides a better time for the athlete. So
I love it.
Yeah, it's super important.
Beautiful. That's what we got. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about testing. A lot of different groups, different universities do a lot of different types of testing, and we're going to talk specifically on why testing is important, when it should be implemented, and how it adds value to a program. Thanks.